Today on Cornell Keynotes, we explore the possibilities of life after depression, and we're joined by Jonathan Rottenberg, who is professor in the Department of Psychology and director of the Better Outcomes Lab at Cornell. John and I delve into his research. We learn a little bit about his personal experience as a depressed person. We discuss disability and disclosure of depression at work, and are introduced to his Ever After video series on understanding the challenges and opportunities of life after depression. Roughly 1 in 5 people are clinically diagnosed with depression. And to kick off this live keynote that we recorded last week, we opened by polling our live audience and learned that 65% of them were either living with depression or had a family member who was directly impacted, which made our discussion that much more urgent and personal. So let's open with that poll question, John, before you and I get going, to kind of take the temperature of our audience, gauge the level of experience with depression among our audience. So here's how this works. Please answer this question, 1, 2, or 3. Have you or someone close to you been clinically diagnosed with depression? Number 1, I've been diagnosed. Yes, someone close to me has been diagnosed, or no. So in the meantime, while we wait for that to populate, John, I want to ask you, what is depression? How do you define it?
So depression is a mood disorder, and it's a profound state involving symptoms like feeling sad, losing interest or pleasure in things, and then a number of other associated symptoms. So it's a syndrome. So these symptoms come together. And unfortunately, depression tends to be disabling and also is accompanied by a lot of distress if people feel quite bad. And in severe cases, people might actually become suicidal.
Here's where our audience, how we've tuned in, right? So yes, I've been diagnosed, about 65% of our audience. So which is really helpful, right? It helps us maybe tune our conversation as we go through it. Knowing that most people have a clinical diagnosis of depression.
So in the population at large, about 1 out of every 5 adults has been diagnosed. So our viewership here are quite a bit higher than the background rate.
So what do we know generally about the prognosis of depression? Typically, what do people encounter in a clinical setting? That is, what are your chances of getting through this, or how are you going to manage it, that kind of thing? How do people talk about it in the clinical capacity?
Yeah. So, for those of you who have had that experience of being diagnosed, I think this is a really important question. Probably if you were in a treatment setting, this is a question that came up. What can I expect? And for better or worse, our epidemiology, decades of epidemiology has come to the conclusion that typically depression is recurrent. So meaning if you had one episode, you're likely to have another. And that in addition to that, it's likely that you'll have some degree of continuing symptoms. So even during better periods, there's some still burden of depression with you. That's the conventional epidemiology. It's based largely on samples of people who were either inpatient or in treatment. And that ends up being very important in that the picture, though it is accurate for that group, may not be accurate for all depressed people, because not all depressed people are inpatients or in treatment. So the truth is that your mileage may vary. You've probably heard that phrase.
Sure.
Right? So for about half of people who have depression, it is recurrent. But for the other half, it is not. And in fact, benign forms, you could call benign forms, are people who have only one single lifetime episode of depression. That's very common, and we don't actually know so much about that very large group of people.
Good to know. So I'm going to ask our audience a second question, which is, I think, a useful follow-up as well. Since we all have aspirations for life after mental health problems, what would you value the most in recovery from depression? So again, we're going to 65% of our audience having been clinically diagnosed. A, being able to function well again. B, the return of my old self. A reduction in symptoms is the third choice, and experiencing happiness. So can you tell me, you provided those answers for me, why you chose that framework? I had asked you, should we do a word cloud?
Yeah.
And multiple choices where we landed. Why do you say that?
Well, part of it is that so much of the field, and I hope that some people do endorse a reduction of symptoms, because I think that is important, that people have the sadness or the inability to concentrate or the feelings of worthlessness, all these, or sleep disturbance, all these really quite troubling symptoms, and they want to have less of those symptoms. But the field, clinical research, in treatment research is 100% geared towards symptom reduction as the main outcome. In my intuition in our research and the research of other people suggests that actually depressed people have a wide variety of aspirations for their life, and reduction in symptoms is just one piece of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so actually, that's very interesting.
Is this
I'm looking at the
surprise
looking
majority
at the
here?
results.
So this is 43% of our audience.
I mean, I think it's wild that so again, I'll just give you the gap between current practice and research and these results. So there was a review in Clinical Psychology Review, one of the main review journals in clinical psychology, of depression outcome studies, decades of research.
Mm-hmm.
So these are people who looked at long-term follow-up, and all the studies measured symptoms, but only 5 to 10% of the studies measured the most popular answer here, being able to function well again. It's generally not measured. So there's this huge, I see in these results, what I was, I guess, hoping to see, because I think it's really true, that there's this big gap between what people want or what people aspire to and what our research has focused on. And again, I don't mean to minimize symptoms. Symptoms are important. Symptoms can be disabling. And in fact, about 10% of people said the most important thing for me is to have a reduction of symptoms. But when we, for example, evaluate treatments that, like, for example, I have a new medication, that is the only endpoint, by and large, is reducing symptoms. So they're leaving out the other 90% of people who had other things that they thought were more important.
And then, we were talking a little bit before the show about a higher sort of philosophical view of this kind of thing. We're very much accustomed to managing symptoms. And for many people, from what I understand, I'll ask you, if that's been the experience with people in a clinical setting, at best, we can hope to manage your symptoms, and that's the way it's going to go down.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
I think it's obviously important to develop treatments to help people manage their symptoms. Completely agree with that. And I think that we have developed treatments that can, on average, reduce people's symptoms. But it's also clear that people want more than that, whether it's returning to their usual self, which a lot of people endorsed, or functioning well. A lot of people endorse that. And we should apply the same, and being happy as well. We should apply the same amount of effort in kind of know-how to those other outcomes.
I want to revisit those results just a moment ago.
Great.
How does the field of mental health rank those outcomes? You had alluded to the fact that, symptoms usually number one, but let's talk about a couple of the other ones there. How is it talked about within the field of mental health?
I mean, I think that if there's practitioners out there, practitioners will have discussed with their clients these other themes, because in part, these are things that the clients will themselves bring up. So for example, returning to your usual self. Part of the nature of depression, and I talked about the symptoms, but the symptoms are very imprisoning. People feel desperately cut off, for example, from their past. They have trouble even imagining times when I wasn't depressed.
Sure.
And so they desperately want this recontact with my former self. That said, researchers really haven't studied this nearly as much. So there's, in clinical practice, and in real people, this is very important. But our researchers have kind of not caught up to the reality of what the consumer, the people on the ground, really care about.
Why do you yourself, John, think that it's important to research even a broader range of good outcomes? What's the utility in that?
Well, what's the point of doing research in depression if we're not making people's lives better? And if we're not addressing the things that are the highest priority for them? It seems to me that then the research community is just talking to itself. Part of it is that symptoms are easier to measure. And part of it is that researchers are imitative. So, we have decades of research, and that's the benchmark. That's the standard by which we evaluate whether or not treatments are working, is whether symptoms have been reduced. But depression is a profound experience. Part of it, yes, involves symptoms, but part of it also involves these other changes, including changes in how you experience yourself or think about your future and so forth.
What do we know about good outcomes, both historically and maybe present-day state-of-the-art research into this? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a deep question. I mean, we could start with the epidemiology that I alluded to at the beginning. I think it scared a lot of people off in the sense that we had all this research, that suggested rather strongly that we could say not so good outcomes were the norm. So typically, if one had an episode of depression, then one could experience another, have a recurrence, and that there would be continuing symptoms. So even during better times, there would be some burden of symptoms. And so I think that is part of why people maybe didn't have the imagination to wonder whether or not, in addition to those not so good outcomes, there would not only be some people who recovered. So we've always known that some people recover, meaning that they no longer have their symptoms, which is great. But we didn't imagine that people might actually be flourishing in some way. That is, doing really well in whatever domain it might be. And so doing really well in relationships, doing really well in their job, doing really well spiritually, or doing really well emotionally. And if you don't imagine that something is very likely, you might not research it. And that's kind of how it was until, like a decade ago. There was virtually no research. I would say virtually no research on good outcomes other than recovery, which is, of course, important and good. That is one symptomatic. So the symptoms are gone. That is one kind of good outcome. And we know that many people fully recover from depression.
How is the research that you're doing at Cornell, how does it challenge these historical assumptions, or rather the trend to kind of envision bleak outcomes and let's make the best of that kind of?
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the research.
I wanted to do hard-headed science. So many of these outcomes, you could say, would be tricky to measure, like, how are you doing well spiritually? Are you doing well even on your job? We all have different jobs, and we might have different ideas about who's doing well. So I wanted to start with a good outcome that most people think is important. And in the survey data, actually, a lot of people indicated that happiness was important, an important good outcome. So we started with psychological well-being, and that had the dual good quality of A, being important to a lot of people who experience mental health problems, and B, being readily measurable. So there's a whole research on what is psychological well-being, what are its components, what are scales that we can use to measure it. And so, armed with knowing that this was an important outcome that we could measure, we took advantage of some very large data sets, national data sets, both in the United States and in Canada. And we asked the question, if you have depression, diagnosed depression, real depression, what is the probability that at a future point in time, you'll report experiencing very high levels of well-being? As high as, say, the top quartile or top even fifth of the non-depressed population.
And that's an individual self-assessing, saying, I imagine an outcome of well-being
Now,
for
this
myself.
is saying that right now I'm experiencing positive emotions.
I understand.
Lack of negative emotions. My relationships are of high quality. I feel that my life is purposeful and meaningful. I feel like I'm in control of my life. All these sort of elements of well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the conventional wisdom would say that this is going to be pretty rare, right? So these people had serious diagnosed depression, and now you're following them up. So it should be like 1%, right, who are really flourishing and reporting these very high levels of well-being. I mean, we knew it would be some people, wouldn't be zero. What we found was that depression cut the chances of reporting high levels of well-being about in half. And about 10% of depressed people went on to report these very high levels of well-being, as opposed to about 21% of the non-depressed population. And I'm a glass half full kind of person, but I think that this was a real eye-opener. This was far from rare.
How long ago did you encounter this data or interpret the data in this kind of way? How long ago was this?
Just a few years ago. These were reported in the 2021, 2022, just a few years ago.
Okay.
Some of the data were longitudinal data sets, so that they may have been collected for some other purpose. So that these were just lying around for reanalysis, right? So I didn't enroll a sample and then wait 10 years. I just took advantage of already collected data and asking a new question that no one had asked before. But I think this really challenges the conventional wisdom that this kind of good outcome is rare and that it'd be very unlikely. In fact, you could imagine that, you think of other bad outcomes, and we have some data on other very serious health challenges We looked at adolescents who had reported a suicide attempt and survived. And we found actually a pretty similar pattern. And suicide, again, is something that people understandably find very frightening and imagine would be associated with all manner of bad outcomes. And they don't associate well-being with it. But the idea that in that group, that is not only depression, but in that group of adolescents who had survived a suicide attempt, that there was a substantial segment, again, who's reporting very high levels of well-being. So this is what I would call an element of realistic hope. So, we always want to be hopeful. We want to tell people, that they have a chance. But this is actual data. So this convinced me that this is real. These good outcomes are real. And this is not an insignificant group of people. And it could also be the case, right? In our study, we were looking at a snapshot in time. So in this national data set, it's called the MIDAS study. It was looking at a 10-year follow-up. And we could ask the question, what % of people 10 years out were reporting high levels of well-being? It doesn't mean that, for other people, it might have been in 15 years. They're not in the study yet. Or it could have been that they were reporting this high level of well-being a few years into the study, and then it went away. So it probably is the case that, if anything, we're undercounting these good outcomes.
And is this a result because, forgive my ignorance, but people simply moving beyond treatment, getting out of the clinical setting? I've gotten through the thing, right? So I'm out of the data pool. How did you account for that kind of stuff? Do you know what I'm getting at?
This is not a treatment sample, so this is a really important distinction to make. So all of the epidemiological studies I'm talking to you about, with only a few exceptions, it's actually pretty amazing how few studies there are of depression in non-treatment samples where they followed the people for decades.
Yeah.
Right? So that's real depression too. Not all people who have depression will be inpatients. Not all people who have depression will be outpatients. Some people will get better on their own, and they're not represented in the epidemiology of depression. And so part of the conclusion is that there's, in a sense, two depressions. There's a kind of depression that has, relatively speaking, a pretty benign outcome, which includes these periods of well-being. And there are the other depression that's probably more associated with recurrence, where you're less likely to see people reporting high levels of well-being. But most of our research is on recurrent depression. So we've really ignored this pretty big, substantial group of people, most of them who have single episodes, many of whom probably get better on their own, who do rather well in the long term.
I have a question from Tori, viewer Tori, who checks in and asks, do you think there is a bias of qualitative data or quantitative data, which is why there is a disconnect between what researchers see as the data assessing what patients need versus what patients say they need?
Ooh, I love that question.
Yeah.
I think so. I think there's a lot of, you could probably have cynical explanations. I don't know if you share these explanations, Tony, but is it Tori?
Tori.
Yep. Tori. That, our process by which we develop medications and treatments, we want a kind of a very replicable, it's almost like assembly line type process, and that's focused on symptoms. And I think a lot of people, in that kind of assembly line, maybe aren't asking the deeper questions and aren't as responsive to what clients or patients really want. And it's really unfortunate. And I think we can put pressure because ultimately these drugs, these treatments should be serving the consumer, right? So if they're not setting the things that people most value, in my eyes, that's a failure. I don't know how else to say it.
Yeah. So what are the next steps for this research? What direction do you see yourself going? And, for our viewers, what do we all need to know about the research that you're doing and which direction you're headed?
Yeah. So these initial studies in the US and Canada were kind of a proof that these good outcomes, specifically well-being after depression, is real and happens surprisingly more often than people might expect. The next step of the research is to begin to understand what explains these good outcomes. So what explains how people make transitions between depression and states of well-being? And we're gearing up. Part of my move to Cornell was to collect these data. So not rely on data that other people have collected, but to collect our own sample where we get to ask the questions about these pathways. And my strong hypothesis or suspicion is that there's not going to be one single road to well-being, that there might be roads that involve how people think about the world or their beliefs. There may be behavioral roads, what people do in their daily lives. This won't necessarily be represented in the study, but it may be ultimately pretty important. There could be some biological basis that explains why some people are likely to have good outcomes. And finally, I suspect that social factors, so who people surround themselves with, what the quality of those relationships are like, probably also explains a significant part of why some people end up enjoying these good outcomes.
So how do you see this data changing, for instance, those in our audience, their views about life after depression?
Well, my hope is that this really inspires people to think more deeply about the question. So if you just think that depression ends and hopefully I don't have symptoms anymore, there isn't really much space. And here we maybe get beyond research studies that I'm doing to talk a little bit more about the philosophical aspects of depression. What a profound experience this is. I mean, depression can make you question everything about what you're doing in your life, who you are, where you're going. And fortunately, most people get better, but they may not actually really process this experience very deeply and thinking about it only in terms of symptoms and not about their broad aspirations. So there's really two parts. I think one part is let's think about what depression is and how it affects people more broadly. And then the second part is let's be maybe giving more credibility to these aspirations. Like, what if, just imagine a world where we took seriously that it was possible for people to lead these full, happy lives after depression, and that wasn't rare. Like, what would that world look like if we were talking like this was really possible? So that's my hope, that in terms of the broader impacts of the work and what people are thinking about, that the audience, if they are thinking about that more than they were before, I'm really happy, because I feel like it's been kind of lurking beneath maybe just kind of a side conversation that people sometimes have, but not, so like, is there life after depression? Ha ha ha. A lot of people really don't necessarily have the most positive aspirations. So they think of depression as something that could only limit you, could only constrain you, could only damage you. And it makes the future very scary, right? Like, what is my future? Do I have a future?
Would you tell us about your personal experience in life as a person with depression?
Sure. Yeah, so depression really was something that when I was a young person came on all of a sudden, and it crushed my aspirations, certainly at the time.
Where were you? What were you doing?
I was studying history as a graduate student at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. And I very suddenly had these very confusing, they were very physical, the symptoms initially, very physical. And I didn't understand them. I didn't understand that this could be depression. And it was actually a long process to get diagnosed, in a confusing process, and in sort of an unpleasant process too. And the depression lasted for a very long time and led me to drop history. And I was I was horrified, that I was having this experience, but there was a parallel part of me that was also fascinated by this experience. What is this? What is this monster that is sort of me? And that really put me on a completely different track to study psychology, change careers, and set in motion, my desire to understand depression as an emotional state, and then ultimately to the research that I've been doing in the last 6 or 7 years on good outcomes. So it had a big change in my life because of my depression.
Now, to what degree or how did that experience, how does it inform the research that you do, your particular approach? You had mentioned kind of, I accept the challenge, right? So you saw it as mission critical to figure this thing out.
Yeah.
How does that inform your research?
I think I do think back to my experience a lot. So, for example, I remember seeing psychiatrists and seeing that there was a lot that they didn't understand. And these were people that you're literally putting your life is in their hands. And that there was a lot of mystery there, and B, that the quality of the information about what can I reasonably expect, there wasn't a lot of information, and it was actually quite terrifying. It was quite terrifying to read this epidemiology that I read on my own, and also was conveyed to me. I was at one point an inpatient. So, for the most severe mental health problems, there is inpatient care still. And if you read and hear about, well, what could you expect if you're an inpatient for depression, it would be pretty bleak. And so as time wore on and I've functioned better and I've reflected on this experience, I started to wonder, is that really true? Is that really all true that, that there's no good outcomes or very rare outcomes? And so I just had this intuition like, well, maybe I should study. Yeah. Maybe I should be the one to actually put some data on this rather than just, but I do think of myself as a confused young person, kind of petrified about the future. So I think we just need data to fill that void.
Speaking of which, so question from Liana, one of our viewers, who asks, how does long-term depression, years or decades, fit into that data, into the current research? What do we know about that? Or shifts from episodic to recurrent depression?
Yeah.
Two-part question.
Yeah. So I love the question. I want to say that it's important in talking about these good outcomes where people have single episodes that we need to bear in mind. There's this whole other reality of recurrent depression and chronic depression. And I don't think anyone can wave a magic wand and say, oh, it's not so bad, because that really can be terribly burdensome. There's a lot of research on recurrent and chronic depression. But my hope is the research that we're doing on good outcomes, so understanding why some people over the long term do rather well, can be used to help more people emerge from these more painful, longer term chronic depressions. Can we use knowledge about people who do well to people who are still struggling? I think that's a really underutilized kind of approach, thinking about depressed people in a sense, almost like teaming up and sharing what works. Obviously, the researcher has to intercede as the one to weigh that, because I think that this kind of research has hope not only for people who might be experiencing the first episode and saying, oh, am I going to be one of these people who has a more benign outcome? But can we also apply this to people who have had longer term experience with depression? I mean, my depression would be classified as chronic. It went on for a number of years. Mm-hmm. I do think that it's probably something that makes it a little bit less likely to have these extremely good outcomes, but it's clearly not impossible, right? And it's important, even if something is relatively uncommon, it's really important to study what goes into that, what explains that, even if it's only a few people, but it's probably more than just a few people.
Before I met you, I had seen some videos of yours as part of your Ever After series. This is a video series that you can link to through the link tree that we'll share in the chat. You've put this on the socials, right? Instagram, Facebook, etc. Let's talk about this digital outreach project that you're doing. You had talked about, to some degree, alluded in your last response about building community. Let's hang together and figure this thing out. Tell me a little bit about Ever After and what you're trying to accomplish here.
Yeah, so I think just in the research community, there hasn't been as much dialogue about life after depression. I would like to spark that conversation outside the research dialogue. So in this particular segment, I'm outside talking about my experience in depression, specifically my experience in not talking about depression, not including depression in my life story, and the gap that this left, and the feeling that maybe I wasn't even being completely honest about an important part of myself, and the process by which I gradually reintegrated it into my life story and all the benefits that had. So there's a lot to life after depression. There's a lot to talk about, the ways that it affects how we think about ourselves and our future, and even processing the ways that depression may, in some ways, help us move forward in our lives. Those are all themes that we want to address in the series.
You know, something that really got to me when you talking about your depression with your daughter, right, and other family members. We have viewer Tracy who checks in and asks pretty early on how one can assist a loved one that is depressed. What about those of us in our audience and otherwise? What advice or, what do you say to those people?
Well,
who have family members who are struggling with
this? The support
those
people are so important.
Yeah.
Because it can be a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
And you're the people with the with the water and the bananas, helping the person get through it. You can't do it yourself, but being empathetic and open and non-judgmental, you could be amazed how far that can go in helping people keep going as long as it takes and showing that steadiness. That would be my main advice is you don't give up on them and you let them know that you're there to talk about it. If they want to talk about it, if they want to talk about other things, that's okay. But you're not going to be one of these fair weather friends or people who are too afraid to go to sort of engage with the person's pain. I think that it's a human problem. So being a good human being, a good empathetic human being, there's no magic. You may not have the answers, right? They may not have the answers, but being a support, it literally can be life-saving. I have had a spouse who stuck with me for a number of years in a really tight spot. And I think she might have wondered, am I doing the right thing here? But, it came out the other side, and I really owe her a tremendous debt, I think, in some ways.
From where you sit, what do you think can be done to destigmatize conversations around depression?
Well, we're doing it right now. So
yes.
I'm not kidding. So being matter of fact and really normalizing it as part of the human experience. It's not a part of the human experience that people like to talk about. A lot of people who go through it actually don't want to talk about it anymore. They feel like that happened and they never really fully process this, and they never really find ways to use it to their advantage in some ways, because people can actually learn things during their depression. So I think that talking about depression, thinking about depression, realizing that depression is probably going to be some part of your identity, not your whole identity, but part of your identity, and creating forums like this for people to engage, I think are really important. I think that there's going to be big changes, particularly in younger people. Younger people are way more comfortable talking about mental health problems than I'm not going to say I'm older, but I'm older than my daughter. And I think that there are going to be some sea changes to finally get our society less having attitudes of stigma and people feel shame around these problems.
I agree with you. In one generation, it seems to be we're making tremendous progress. We have a viewer, anonymous viewer, who mentioned that depression is taboo at work. Right?
Oh.
How to manage the symptoms. And that's a huge deal, right?
Huge.
To expose that perceived weakness as
100%.
opposed to just, a component of who you are is a big problem. Now let's back up a little bit and let's remember that you're not a clinician.
Right.
Right? You're a researcher. But given that, let's talk about how to, again, further destigmatize this kind of stuff, but also for the person that is having symptoms at work.
Well,
Any advice? Because you've had symptoms at work.
Absolutely. Well, I think, first of all, I just have to empathize with so in terms of there's all this progress, young people have the answer.
Yeah.
There's two forums, I think, in particular, where disclosure is extremely difficult. One would be in workplace settings. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like we really would need to look at changing workplace laws.
Yes.
And then the other is in relationships. So people find it very difficult, very confusing. When do I introduce this part of my history in a relationship, knowing that many people have all kinds of negative associations and fear about mental health problems? And again, not having the answer, but really fully empathizing with what this person is going through, because that is part of the reality that we cannot happy talk our way out of, that we still live in a society where there's a lot of judgment passed in those particular settings. I think, now among friends, things might be better. In kind of public dialogue, we're making progress, the younger generation making progress. But there are these domains where we haven't made as much progress as you would think. And employment is a big one, which is why a lot of people are hiding their symptoms. They're hiding their symptoms. I wouldn't advise this person, just go to your boss and tell them the full story and expect, that they will, because I don't know the boss. I don't know the organization.
Well, that's right. We've done some past keynotes, and for our viewers, you can check those out on our website, but we've done disabilities at work and the laws around that and disclosure and everything that comes with it. It's an imposing process to get involved with. So for those out there, let's talk about resources a little bit. I want to provide some positive outcomes and work toward positive outcomes. And, we had talked a little bit about this before. We're not going to solve it all right now. But what we are going to hopefully do for our audience is to elicit further action. So let's talk about some of the resources that we have available here. Better Outcomes Laboratory. For our viewers who want to visit, what's in store? Can you talk a little bit about the research that you have ongoing or in the near future?
Yeah. So the link tree that will take you to all of the social media that I was talking about with this Ever After project in the video that you saw. There will also soon be links if you're interested in becoming involved in this research as a participant. We're collecting data on people who have experiences with depression, who are in transition. Hopefully there'll be people who are transition and have made it all the way to well-being. There are also resources on the website about how to find help. So, for example, how to find a therapist. And for people who might be in crisis, there's links to Crisis Line as well.
Exactly, National Institute of Mental Health, et cetera. So I really appreciate those resources that you've given us. Thank you, John Rottenberg, for visiting with us today. It's been for me, I've learned a ton, and I think our audience hopefully has as well. Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
It was wonderful to be here. Thank you, Chris.
There are lots of shared resources in this episode, so be sure to check the episode notes for helpful links and next steps.